Hello and welcome to episode 88 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh DeHaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Christine Van Gyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Barron, the CCF's executive director. In today's episode, I'll tell you about a new bill out of Quebec that is proposing to require all individuals to adhere to common civic values.
And I'll tell you about our new report coming out today about Canada's worst censorship bylaw.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to tell you about the federal government's huge new border security bill, which has people from the left to the right raising various civil liberties concerns. All right, strap in because this is quite a bill, and I'm going to talk about several different aspects
It's a
of it. And I
big,
know
beautiful bill, Josh.
I don't think it's beautiful. It's definitely big. Parts of it are beautiful, maybe. Anyway, so C-2 was dropped on Tuesday, and it's more or less the government's response to a few different problems that the Liberals have let fester in recent years, including the fentanyl crisis and fake asylum claims. But it also has some pretty far-reaching consequences for privacy, and we're still trying to figure out what all of those are. So the piece of the bill that's getting the most attention is the immigration stuff, and in particular, the fact that it's going to make it harder to make asylum claims. So people who have been in Canada for more than a year won't be able to make an asylum claim anymore. And this is very clearly targeting the temporary residents, mostly international students, who are going to have their visas expire in very large numbers in the next year. And as those visas start to expire, a lot of them have been making asylum claims, which are not really good faith claims because these are people from, safe countries who came here to study or whatever. Another part of the bill related to immigration that you'd think would be getting even more attention by now is that it essentially allows the minister to just freeze immigration. He or she can just take all of the applications in the system and just dump them and say no more immigration for a period of time, or do that with particular types of immigration, particular streams. And I think it's pretty likely they're going to have to do that because the Liberals set a target of reducing temporary residents to 5% of the population, which, by the way, is way higher than it would have been even just 5 years ago. But because there are just so many people in the country whose visas are expiring, they might need to freeze immigration just to get down to that number, which is still quite a high number historically. So that's the immigration stuff. The second big part of this bill that's getting a lot of attention has to do with changes to the Canada Post Act. They're going to allow customs officers to open letter mail. So right now they can only open your packages, the idea being that your letters are more private than your Timu order. I don't know if that's necessarily true. This change is obviously aimed at reducing fentanyl, which is a powder that's so potent you can fit huge quantities of it in a letter-sized envelope. And so police have been pushing for this power for years. The interesting thing here, I think, is that you would think that they would write some privacy protections into the bill, like, they can open letter mail, but they can't read it, or things like that, which they don't appear to have done. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some pushback against this part for not protecting privacy. A third part of the bill that's raising eyebrows on the sort of libertarian right is Section 77.51 of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, if the bill passes, which would make it illegal to pay, donate, or deposit more than $10,000 of cash at a time, except with, banks and financial institutions. So, that means individuals, small businesses won't be able to deal with large amounts of cash at all anymore. You couldn't just go out and buy a used car or a boat in cash. And this feels kind of icky just because it's your money, right? You should be able to do what you want with it to some degree. This is almost certainly aimed at money laundering and tax evasion, but it's got a lot of people who are really concerned about keeping their transactions private for perfectly legitimate reasons worried. Now, a fourth part of the bill that got some attention already is the relaxed rules for government and financial institutions to share your personal information under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. So if this bill passes, Section 11.711 would let banks and other financial institutions collect an individual's personal information without their knowledge or consent if the RCMP or another prescribed government department or law agency gives it to them for the purpose of detecting money laundering, terrorist activity, or sanctions evasions. And this set off some alarm bells for people because it reminded them of what happened during the Emergencies Act invocation when the RCMP started collecting personal information without a warrant of people involved in the protests and sending that to hundreds of financial institutions, violating their privacy so that they could freeze their bank accounts. And I think the concern here is somewhat justified and somewhat overblown. It's probably overblown since it does really just apply to, terrorists and money launderers. And, police and financial institutions already work together, but this just makes it a bit easier. But I do see where people are coming from because this government, including the Prime Minister, have played fast and loose with definitions like who is a criminal and who is a terrorist. As we know, Prime Minister Carney, before the invocation of the Emergencies Act against the truckers, wrote a Globe and Mail article where he called them all seditionists, which was pretty outrageous. So he thought they were criminals. And this government has also officially designated the quite obnoxious but relatively harmless far-right group, the Proud Boys, as terrorists, putting them in the same category as Hamas and Al-Qaeda and making it illegal to deal with them. And we also recently learned that, bank CEOs during the Freedom Convoy were pushing Chrystia Freeland to label the Freedom Convoy participants as terrorists so that you could use this act against them to freeze their accounts. So it's not crazy to worry when the government is making that type of thing easier. And the final section of this that I want to talk about briefly that could have pretty wide-reaching consequences for privacy, but that I'm not entirely filled in on quite yet is the section that would allow public officers, so government employees, to get subscriber information and potentially transmission data from ISPs and cell phone providers. So specifically, the criminal code would allow any peace officer or public officer to demand your subscriber information if they have reasonable grounds to suspect that an offense has or will be committed under any act of parliament. So not just things like the criminal code or the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, but even things like the new internet regulation bills. And I think the purpose of getting the subscriber information is so that they can go to a justice and then get an order to get the transmission data. And transmission data goes further than your subscriber data. It doesn't include the actual substance of your communication, but it does give the police or the government official knowledge about who you're communicating with. So it is a pretty serious privacy concern. So the police or the government will be able to use this subscriber data to get an ex parte order. So an order where you don't even know necessarily that the hearing is taking place, if they believe that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offense has been or will be committed. So it's making it easier to get people's private information without them even knowing. And even in some cases, exigent circumstances, they'll be able to get some of this data without a warrant. So this bill is huge, and the laws that it modifies are enormous themselves. So I don't want to be, prejudging all of this bill. I haven't been able to read through every single part of every one of those bills. And I think we'll have to figure out, is the privacy that we're giving up with this bill worth the benefits in tackling organized crime and drug trafficking, etc. And I think it's too early to really know, but I just wanted the listeners to know that we're watching this and we hope the conversation continues. Joanna, I know you were asked to talk about this bill yesterday and you opened it up and it was, enormous, right? And so we're just still trying to figure out what's in it. But what jumps out at you so far? Is there anything that you're worried about, or are people just overreacting so far?
Yeah, I don't think they're overreacting. I think there's definitely some shady parts of the bill. There's three that really got my antenna up. First, the change to the Canada Post Act. We were just talking about this right before we hopped on the recording. That would allow customs officers to open letter mail. Letters have always been treated as especially private. I mean, I don't know who sends letters anymore, but it certainly has financial information. And it's true, of course, that fentanyl can fit in an envelope. But as you mentioned, the bill doesn't include any protections to stop officers from reading the actual content of letters. And it may be that it's just impractical if they're going to open it up, that, what are they going to do? Avert their eyes. But that doesn't seem like minimally impairing of the Section 8 right against unreasonable search and seizure. Second, the cash transactions ban on cash transactions over $10,000, which would, I guess, criminalize you for putting down cash for a car or a boat or even a donation to a charity. And obviously, we want to crack down on money laundering, but this seems like blanket surveillance of how we as Canadians use our own money. And third, and what you won't be surprised to hear, I think seems to me the most dangerous piece, is the provision that would allow the government and cops to share your financial information with a bank without your consent or with a warrant. This is a huge red flag. And as you mentioned, it has uncomfortable echoes to what we saw during the Emergencies Act invocation. The government was willing, and Mark Carney, who was then not in government, but was willing to label peaceful protesters as seditious or national security threats and freeze their bank accounts. And that precedent of government working really hand in glove with financial institutions to punish dissent should make us very cautious. Anything to add, Christine?
I don't have a whole lot to add on the cash transaction element. That one really stood out to me. It it really is going to put up red flags for anyone who is concerned about, a move towards digital currency or anything like that. I can just see that fueling that fire of, some of it's conspiratorial, some of it's not, because I know there actually is uh, a, a movement towards this digital currency that's been discussed internationally. The other thing that I wanted to point out is something that Josh had said separately last night when we were reviewing this bill. Can you just imagine what the reaction would be if a conservative politician decided to give the immigration minister the unilateral power to freeze all immigration? Like, people would be going apoplectic. It would be just like, oh, accusations of racism, of, this is Donald Trump, this is horrible. But I haven't seen that today on the CBC. So I guess we'll see. Maybe it'll come soon. Oh, Josh, you're muted.
Sorry, I was just going to say there's been a little bit of that from the NDP, and I thought that was interesting because you would think that they would probably just support this bill, that they're not in a position to not to, but so far they seem to be
But they have so much
going
influence right now.
apoplectic. Yeah.
Okay, let me turn to my segment. I'm going to talk about a big piece of news from us at the Canadian Constitution Foundation. So you might have noticed that we are releasing this episode a day later than normal, and that is because today we are announcing a brand new award that we are giving out for the worst censorship bylaw in Canada. If you're only listening to this instead of watching on YouTube, which you should check out on YouTube, I'm holding our gorgeous new Municipal Muzzle Award. So if you are on our email list, which you can sign up for at the ccf.ca/freedom updates, you would have gotten an email from us asking us to help name this award. This is the award for the worst municipal bylaw for censorship, and we named it the Municipal Muzzle Award. That was the crowd favorite. So to put together this award to figure out who actually has the worst bylaw. We had some awesome interns from Osgoode Hall Law School who helped us review bylaws from hundreds of Canadian municipalities. Josh then put in many hours of additional legwork reading through everything they'd compiled and compiling his own list. And
Many hours.
the poor report was many hours of work. So I am thrilled today to announce the three winners of the Municipal Muzzle Award, or maybe three losers. I guess it depends on your perspective. So the second runner-up is South Bruce Peninsula, and this is a town in Ontario. And this nomination was actually sent in from a CCF supporter. So if you have good ideas, send them to us. If your town is doing something wrong, let us know because I'm going to be heading up to South Bruce Peninsula to give this award to them. So they have an outrageous bylaw that prohibits picketing in any public place unless authorized by the town. And picketing is defined as any activity associated with protesting, objecting, and may include the display of signs, placards, flags, shirts, hats, etc., which portrays a message. It includes even silence. So silent protests are also forbidden by the geniuses who wrote this law in South Bruce Peninsula. Not to be mistaken with South Bruce, which is a different place that we are not giving the award to. It's South Bruce Peninsula. So, the right to protest is a fundamental one. It's protected by the charter. This is a blanket ban on public protests and without permission. You don't need the government's permission to protest. This law is unconstitutional, and it is the second runner-up for our Municipal Muzzle Award. Congratulations to South Bruce Peninsula for this ridiculous censorship bylaw. Now, the first runner-up is the town of Caledon, which is just north of Toronto. And look, Caledon actually has a lot of bad bylaws. The town is mentioned multiple times in our report, but the bylaw that got them the runner-up for the municipal muzzle is one that prohibits insulting important people. So this particular bylaw is part of their rules governing conduct and decorum at meetings. And look, a lot of towns have rules about decorum and conduct at meetings. For the most part, these laws are not objectionable. They make sense so that meetings can be conducted in an orderly and efficient manner. But some towns, like Caledon, take these too far and start targeting speech based on its content. And Caledon is the worst offender. In Caledon, a bylaw prohibits members of council and members of the public from speaking at meetings and using indecent, offensive, or insulting language, as well as speaking disrespectfully of certain politicians, whether they're federal politicians, provincial, regional, or members of the council, or even employees of the town. So you're not allowed to disrespect, the prime minister. Who decides what is disrespectful? The town. So it's an entirely subjective criteria that can't possibly be constitutional. It is a fundamental right to criticize our elected leaders using whatever words we want. And that's a really important right that many people around the world don't have. It should not be curtailed, even in council meetings. So congratulations, Caledon, on being our first runner-up for the Municipal Muzzle Award. And finally, the winner of the first place worst censorship bylaw is Calgary. Now, you have heard me talk about Calgary before and talk about this particular bylaw, the Safe and Inclusive bylaw that bans protests in certain places. This is a form of bubble zone law. This is, an Orwellian named law. Safe and inclusive actually means you are banned and might get arrested. So whatever the opposite is, that's what the law actually means. So it is especially dangerous because it gets the government involved in deciding what topics can be protested and what topics cannot be protested. Once the government is deciding what topics you're allowed to protest, that right doesn't have any meaning whatsoever anymore because it's generally government action that people want to protest. So Calgary's bylaw forbids what are called specified protests within 100 meters of an entrance to a city-operated recreation facility or library. And it defines specified protest not just as a large gathering, but as any expression of objection or disapproval about a long list of topics. So the bylaw, because it doesn't actually relate to gatherings, just any expression of disapproval, it could apply to people having a private conversation overheard on the street near a library. It could apply to random outbursts from the people suffering from mental illness who use the drop-in center right next to the library. It, of course, would also apply to gatherings protesting various government policies, which is something that we have a constitutionally protected right to do. And it relates to a certain list of topics: sex, gender, race, religion, gender identity, gender expression, place of origin, family status. So it could apply to all kinds of things. Basically anything you want to protest, this bylaw will prohibit that near a library. And it is explicitly aimed at eliminating speech on the basis of the content. And one of the reasons we gave this award to Calgary is it's because after they did this, they inspired a number of other municipalities to implement similar laws. Calgary was the first bubble zone law about this type of speech. And after they passed theirs in 2023, we saw bylaws that are similar passed in Vaughan, Brampton, Oakville, and now in my hometown of Toronto. So the fact that it started this fire of these unconstitutional, illegal laws is one of the reasons Calgary deserves the the award so much. So I am actually going to be visiting two of the runners-up, the Caledon and South Bruce Peninsula, today to present the award. I'm not visiting Calgary because, well, I was just there. We're actually challenging the Calgary bylaw, and our legal challenge was heard in February, so we're waiting for a decision. So you may be wondering, are we going to challenge Caledon's bylaw? Are we going to challenge South Bruce Peninsula's bylaw? I would love to challenge them. And there are actually many, many others that are listed in the report, so you should go and read it. So listeners, go read the report. If you see that your town is listed as one of the towns considered in the report, please write to me. Tell me how you've been impacted by this bylaw. If you've been charged under one of these bylaws in our report, I would love to hear what happened to you and what your story is. So you can find me at on our website, theccf.ca. You can also email me at cvangein@theccf.ca. Josh, Joanna, those were our top 3 winners, but there are so many more. Josh, I'll start with you. What bylaw really stood out to you as a problem aside from our 3 winners?
So there were a few bylaws in here, well, more than a few, that try to regulate mean words uttered in public parks. And this seems to be a trend in Canada where municipalities think that they can outlaw people saying words that other people don't like in parks. But I think the craziest one that we came across is in Grande Prairie, Alberta. And you would think Alberta, all about the freedom, that they wouldn't have any of these insane laws, but there are actually a lot of sort of nanny state laws in local municipalities in Alberta. So in Grande Prairie, they have a bylaw that says that bullying is any objectionable or inappropriate comment, conduct, or display by a person directed at an individual not of the same household. So it's okay to bully your little brother or whatever, but not anyone else, that is likely to cause physical or emotional distress. And the bylaw goes on to apply to any public place, and that includes electronic communication. So in Grande Prairie, according to the municipality, you can't bully, and that means make any inappropriate comment towards anyone in any public place, including on social media, in email, or in other online forums. And a bylaw officer could come to your house and ticket you if you said something mean on social media or in a park to another person in Grande Prairie. That can't possibly be constitutional. You have no right to be offended. The government can regulate hate speech according to the Supreme Court, but that is the most extreme forms of detestation and vilification based on particular grounds. So the idea that Grand Prairie thought that they can just create tickets for bullying or inappropriate comments online is pretty hilarious to me. Joanna, what do you think? What stood out for you in the report?
So this is in the category of like, how did they even come up with this? It's creative and not in a good way. And this actually was recently repealed, but worth mentioning. Brantford, Ontario had a property maintenance bylaw. It prohibited murals on private property unless they depict scenes relating to the natural and cultural history of Brantford and outlying area, which enhance the streetscape and are visually attractive. So this means that if you wanted to have a mural of, I don't know, like a pastoral scene or whatever, or ancient Greece or the Last Supper to make it a little religious belief related on your own property, because that is your artistic taste, the city of Brantford would not allow it. They would only allow jingoistic pro-Brantford art, which is just completely crazy. And happily, this was repealed on March 25th. Maybe they intuited that this report was coming, but similar laws still exist in different parts of Ontario. For example, Ottawa only allows murals if they reflect and depict culture, history, or visions of artistic expression in a tasteful and positive manner, which is not as bad, but I personally have zero faith in the bureaucrats of Ottawa, which I would not say is a particularly beautiful city. Sorry to my Ottawa friends. I know there are parts of it that are beautiful, just not the parts like in downtown Ottawa. Yeah, I don't want them judging my taste. What if I have, very, very
Good taste.
edgy, hard taste? And that's
I just I love the idea that only pro Brantford
yeah.
murals are allowed, and like imagining what that means. It's like only pictures of horses and Wayne Gretzky. Like what is a pro Brantford mural? I love it.
Yeah.
It's like so absurd.
Yeah. All right, well, let's take a break and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the latest mischief out of Quebec. Okay, so we're going to dig in briefly into a significant development out of Quebec. Bill 84 is a new law that was just passed this month. It requires immigrants, or sorry, last month, end of May. It requires immigrants to adopt what the government calls the province's common culture, which includes values like gender equality, secularism, and of course, primacy of the French language. But it also gives the province new power to withhold funding from organizations and events that don't reflect those values. And it explicitly frames itself as a rejection of Canada's multiculturalist model, which celebrates diversity rather than cohesion or assimilation. And critics, like, for example, the CCLA, as well as other groups, are calling it assimilationist, heavy handed, and even xenophobic. But I actually think this deserves a deeper conversation, and it does raise some constitutional concerns, but there's some nuance to it. So first of all, I want to be transparent. I have a lot of sympathy for Quebec as a distinct nation. I spent a lot of my life there, and I believe it is certainly distinct, whatever you think about that distinction. Last week, I was in Montreal, being hosted by our friends at the Montreal Economic Institute, and teaching their young professionals and students program called Liberty and Leadership. Shout out to Kate Marland, who is now, by the way, full-time running that program, which is so, I just love that for her. As a former running lead director, I know that's like a dream job at that point in your life. But anyways, I attended a talk by an old friend of mine, and I think Christine, you probably know him too, because we all interned at the same time, Carl Vallée. And Carl served as principal secretary to Stephen Harper. Vallée described himself in this talk as proudly both a federal conservative, but also a Quebec first. And I respect that. Quebec has a profound culture. It has a unique legal tradition in the civil law, and of course, a long-standing and justified anxiety about its long-term survival within a larger Anglo majority, not just federation, but continent. And so when the Quebec government says that multiculturalism doesn't work for them, they're not just making a policy argument, they're asserting their national identity and their what they see as their existential need to preserve it. So that deserves some degree of respect. Now, that being said, Bill 84 does raise some serious constitutional red flags. So first, it empowers the government to tie public funding to ideological conformity, to deny support to community organizations that don't promote what it defines as common culture in Quebec. And it also amends Quebec's Charter of Rights and Freedoms to say that individual freedoms must be exercised, quote unquote, in conformity with an integration policy. And that gets dangerously close to state enforced belief. And of course, a liberal democracy, we know this, we've said this a million times, thrives on freedom to dissent and to speak and live differently, even in ways that the majority culture might find uncomfortable. And so when the government starts punishing expression in ways that fall outside the norm, it really creates fear, not unity. But the last thing I'll say, and now I'm stepping into somewhat shaky territory, but it's important to say that we're not shaky, sensitive territory, but I really want to be honest about this. We need to be honest about the limits of pluralism, especially now, particularly in a post-October 7th world where in this country we've seen consistent, explicit celebration of terrorism, posters of kidnapped children being ripped down, chants glorifying murder. And that this has really broken something open for me. I think about it all the time. It's, not all values are compatible in a free society. And unbounded, infinite pluralism can absolutely and has been weaponized by those who do not believe in Western values and reciprocity. So we need some type of model that says all are welcome here. It doesn't matter what your belief is. It doesn't matter what culture you came from. It certainly doesn't matter what color your skin is. But not if you seek to dismantle the foundations and the liberties and the mutual obligations and sort of agreements on nonviolence, that terrorism and political violence are never defensible, then that cannot be part of the mix. So to go back to Bill 84, it gets one thing right, which is that, yes, a society needs a shared foundation. The Quebec government is right to affirm that gender equality, secular government, separation of church and state, and linguistic unity in the case of Quebec are not optional. They're bedrock values. But I would say we can't legislate that, and we certainly can't find our way out of the post-October 7th mess through coercion. The integration has to be inspired. We have to invite people into a shared civic project and make the case to them that it's worthy of them joining. So that's my take on Bill 84. It's a bit of a warning signal, but it has parts of its inspiration that I would say are legitimate. And also, as with all of these laws, we don't know exactly how it's going to operate, but we'll be watching it. So pluralism with a spine, what do you think about that, Josh? I know we've had some conversations and you are very consistent on Twitter on calling out some of the disgusting things that go on Canadian streets every day.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you just said there. I'm really worried about this. I think that our liberal values are really important, and we need to preserve those. But at this point, there are a lot of people coming to Canada that don't share even the basic values of the country, like, don't act out violently towards other people, don't, hate particular minority groups, treat both sexes equally, etc. And so clearly something has to change. I don't think Quebec's bill is necessarily the way to do it, but it's something we need to keep talking about. And the federal government needs to probably act on this. They just came out with this big border security bill, and people are complaining about some of the changes to asylum, but it doesn't actually really change all that much. And you're still probably going to see Hundreds of thousands of people a year just show up in Canada, and some of them will be here. Most of them will be here because they want a better life and are willing to become Canadian. But some of them just want to come here to take advantage of Canada. And if they don't have any interest in becoming Canadian, they shouldn't be here. And we need to figure out a way to send those people back, which so far our federal leaders have refused to do. I just want to note the coalition in the Netherlands just fell apart. They're going into an election over this very issue because the party that got the most votes, which is the Geert Wilders party, they proposed a crackdown on asylum. They want a freeze on asylum seekers, something we could easily see in Canada. And the prime minister said no. So the coalition has now fallen apart, and there will be another election on this topic of immigration. So it's not just Canada facing this issue. Christine, what about you? What do you think of this?
I just remember Kelly Leach proposed a Canadian values test for people coming into the country, and it treated with ridicule, scorn, and accusations of racism. And I just want
By the
to
media.
by the media and by like some members of the public. So I just want to point out that what Quebec can get away with, and I'm not, I do have concerns about the Quebec proposal, but it's just like Quebec can just do whatever it wants, and no one in the rest of the country is talking about this. But when Kelly Leach proposed it as like a non-contender, just like an idea as from someone who had zero shot at being prime minister. Sorry, Kelly. It was she was like the worst monster that's ever existed. And I think a lot of people are now like have transitioned to Kelly Leach's perspective on this. I'm not saying that I do or don't share
When
that
was Kelly
perspective,
Leach
but
candidate? Was it like
this was 2016.
2016? That's what I thought. I
Yeah.
completely forgot about Kelly Leach. Yeah, it'd be interesting. Yeah, if post October 7th the uptake there would be a different reaction. I mean,
I,
Polyev didn't try anything like that, so
No, and if he did, I think we all know what the reaction would have been. It would be the same reaction if he proposed giving the immigration minister the power to stop all immigration, which Carney's doing in this new
and maybe
bill.
a
It's
more
just
interesting question is what if Aaron O'Toole proposed it? Because yeah, Polyev couldn't get away with it because of just like his style and who he is, but maybe an Aaron O'Toole could.
I like that you think Aaron O'Toole would propose anything, like anything of substance. I mean, we had the O'Toole bucks we were gonna
Yeah.
get, but that's the only policy I remember O'Toole having, and it was a terrible policy. Do you remember this proposal that instead of having a carbon tax, we would get an environmental spending account, and the government would allow us to create a little savings account, and we could put the carbon tax revenue into that account to then be spent on government approved environmental purchases like a bike or something. I mean, it's like the worst, the
I don't
worst.
remember, but I'm bored already.
I mean, it's a crazy, was a crazy, stupid proposal. So no, I don't think Aaron O'Toole would have proposed this, in on any timeline. Like, there's no version of Aaron O'Toole that would have done that. Let me talk now about my bad legal take for this week. It's related to bubble zone laws because I've been working on this big report about bubble zones for the Macdonald Laurier Institute. I'm hoping that that will come out by the end of the month. And I've been looking through the history of bubble zone laws. You know, they started with abortion clinics, then they moved to hospitals and healthcare facilities during the pandemic. And then as the pandemic wore on, some provinces implemented bubble zones around schools, namely Calgary had a municipal one about advocacy messaging around schools. And then British Columbia passed one that I think is for 150 meters. No, sorry, Calgary is 150 meters. BC is 20 meters around schools. This is K through 12 schools. And this was prompted in BC by some protests about sexual orientation, gender identity teaching in schools, and people who didn't like critical gender theory. And it gives police the power to arrest and issue tickets to anyone found impeding access to or interfering with educational activities or attempting to intimidate within 20 meters of the school. Now, this definition is important because they just used this bubble zone law. And they used it in what I think is a completely absurd scenario. So, this was reporting by the Western Standard, and they reported just 2 days ago, I think, that the BC law, what bubble zone law, was used to prevent a book launch at a school in Abbotsford. And this was a book by an author, activist, and former teacher named Jim McMurtry. And he had planned a book launch outside the school that he had previously taught at. He had been let go from that school due to statements that he had made that people at indigenous residential schools died as a result overwhelmingly of tuberculosis. And he got into a back and forth with a student over this and was ultimately let go. So he wrote a book about this topic. The book is called The Scarlet Lesson. I have not read the book, but I do understand that it makes some controversial claims. And of course, it goes against the prevailing narrative on residential schools in Canada. Now, he wanted to have this book launch in front of the school that he taught at, but in response to this plan, the Abbotsford School District sent him a letter asking him to change location because they said that his book launch is a protest under the bubble zone law. He went to the school anyway to do his book launch anyway. And when he parked his car, he was approached by some undercover police officers informing him that he had to be 20 meters away from the school property. So he went to the sidewalk on the opposite side of the road and he was left alone. But while he was there, the entire school, the Western Standard reports, was evacuated, allegedly for the emotional safety of the students inside. And look, I understand I have not read the book. There may be controversial claims in the book. I don't know. I haven't read it, but books are not dangerous objects that require shielding students, using police, and the evacuation of a school. So even if the book is controversial, it is not a bomb. You don't need to evacuate the school. You don't need to call the police. You just need to ignore it if you don't want to be exposed to an idea that you find offensive or controversial. So my bad legal take goes to BC for the creation of this law, to the school board for calling the police, and to the school for evacuating the school because of this dangerous book. Joanna, what's your bad legal take this week?